Okay, so static, this is for tomorrow's lab. So static is a storage class of variables. Okay, what do we mean by storage class of variables? So the storage class basically specifies when a variable is created and when is it destroyed. When we say when a variable is created, we mean when is it allocated space in random access memory and when is that space taken away from it. So that is what we mean by creation and destruction of a variable. It is not physical creation or physical destruction. It is just allocating space in RAM and deallocating that space. Okay, so this is how variables are created and destroyed. Now some variables have automatic storage class. They are automatically created and automatically destroyed. What do we mean by automatically created and automatically destroyed? For example, if you have a local variable inside a function, so whenever you enter that function, whenever you call that function, if you look at our code from yesterday, so say for example we have this function rect area, okay? Now it has these two variables L and W. These are local variables to the function rect area, and these variables have the automatic storage class. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is whenever you call this function, these variables are created, that is, they are allocated space in RAM, and whenever you are done executing this function and you say return area and you get out of here, these variables are destroyed. So if you enter this function say 1,000 times, these variables will be created 1,000 times and destroyed 1,000 times. Okay. Now this is automatic storage class. This is what we mean by automatic variables. Now opposed to automatic variables or automatic storage class, we have the static storage class. So static, just like the name suggests, static is something that does not move. So static variables are created only once. Static variables are created only once and they are destroyed only once. Whenever your program, like static variables are created, you can say they are created at compile time. Not exactly compile time, but they are created at that. So their lifetime is the same as your program's lifetime. The lifetime of static variables is the same as the lifetime of your program. Whereas the lifetime of, like an automatic variable can have 1,000 lifetimes within a single lifetime of your program. It depends upon how many times you enter and exit that block in which that particular variable is declared or created. Understand? Now this is from computer programming. In computer programming, like we talk about this thing. What do we mean by a static data member of a class? Okay, so a static data member of a class is something different. Now, if you remember our discussion from yesterday, which we will repeat here as well, when you create objects of a class, each object has a separate copy of the data members of that class. So yesterday, say we created two rectangle objects. Now both those rectangle objects, they had separate copies of their length and width data members. Okay, but we didn't add a specific term to that. Okay, what is that term? Every object has a separate copy of its non-static data members. Okay, so we didn't add non-static there. We didn't talk about static or non-static data members. So non-static data members have unique or separate copies for each object of a class. Whereas we can have static data members. Static data members have only one copy for all the objects of a class. There is only one copy of a static data member for all the objects of a class. Okay. So you might ask, okay, when do we need static data members? Okay. So say for example, we are working on a system where we have to model students and faculty and all that, and all the students they belong to, say for example, the same university. We are talking about UET students. So it does not make any sense to store university information for each and every student separately. So we can all have just one copy of the information about your university, like you're all the students of University of Engineering and Technology, Peshawar. So it doesn't make any sense to have a separate copy of that string for every single student object. That does not make any sense. So there can be characteristics which are the same for all the objects of a class. If that is the case, you need to use static data members to store those type of characteristics. If there are characteristics or attributes that can be different for each data member of a class, so then you need non-static data members. Okay. Now this is non-static. These are non-static data members by default. Like these are non-static data members. If you want to create a static data member, then you have to use the static keyword. Then you have to say something like static double w. Then w would become a static data member. You would have only one copy of this data member for the entire class. Okay? So you should be clear about the idea of or the meaning of static and non-static or static and automatic when it comes to the lifetime of variables, and you should also have a clear idea of what static means in the context of object oriented programming. So it is the same keyword and it is the same thing, but it has two different meanings in both these two areas. ठीक है ना? जब हम variables के लाइफ टाइम की बात करें, then static and automatic have different meaning, or when we talk about object oriented programming, classes and objects, then static and non-static have different meaning and interpretation. So you should be aware of that. Acha, so this is like we will talk about static data members and const members. ठीक है? I hope you have heard about const keyword as well. Maybe आपने const float pi नाम का variable कभी programming में use किया या declare किया हो. So when you declare a variable to be const, that means that variable cannot be changed after you initialize it. When you declare it, you have to initialize it, and when you initialize it, after that you cannot change it. That is what const means. So we can have const data members and const member functions. Okay, so what are the implication of those? And then we'll talk about, if time permits, we'll talk about memory concepts, pointers to objects. We have used pointers to objects, but we'll talk about memory model, how your program views the memory, how your program thinks the memory is organized. Any program that you run, so the program has an abstract view of the RAM, of the memory. Okay? So we'll talk about those things as well. So let's get started. So first we'll start with a review of what we did yesterday. Let me change these settings. Duplicate slide. So now this will be recorded, otherwise the recording is different and whatever you see is different. Okay, so yesterday we talked about two programming paradigms, procedural programming and object-oriented programming. So this is what it is. Procedural programming is just a collection of functions, and that collection of functions, like those functions, they interact with each other. One function can call the other and the other can call another one. Usually it is the main function which calls all the other functions. That is how you solve problems. In object-oriented programming, we have objects communicating with each other. Okay, what is an object? An object is basically a collection of operations and data, behavior and attributes, methods and properties, data members and member functions. You can have all these different names, but this is how we define objects. Objects, they encapsulate both state and functions that change or modify that state. Okay, so that is what objects are. So these variables or data, they store the state information, and the functions inside that particular object, those functions modify the state. Now objects interact with other objects through their public member functions. If I have to interact with some object, so that I can only interact with that object through its public interface. Okay? I cannot access private data members or private member functions. Those can only be accessed from within that object, not from outside. Okay? So that is the idea. So in one case you develop a collection of functions to solve a problem. In the other case, you are looking for objects. Which objects do I have in this situation? How to create those objects in an abstract way on your computer, and then how those objects should interact so that the particular problem can be solved. Okay, that is what we talked about yesterday. This is what an object is. Okay, it is basically a collection of operations and data. This is what data encapsulation is. You put the data and the functions that operate on that data together in one package. Okay, so this is what data encapsulation is. We also talked about the features of object-oriented programming languages. What are those features? Data encapsulation, we talked about this. Packing state and behavior into one. So you have state and you have functions that modify that state, and they are put together into one package. This is that data encapsulation. We didn't mention the term data hiding. It is also called information hiding as well. Okay, data or information hiding. What is that? You can restrict access to the data members of a class or member functions of a class for that matter as well. So you can declare a member function or data member as private. So when you do that, you are essentially hiding that data from outside. Okay. So data hiding or restricting your ability to restrict access to some data member or member function, that allows you to implement data validation. If somebody needs to change an attribute, so that person has to go through a public member function in order to access that attribute. Okay. So in this context, we also talked about the accessor functions or get functions or set functions, ठीक है, which allow you to get access to the data members. आप उनको read कर सकते हैं या उनको change कर सकते हैं. And we can have implementer functions as well, which basically use those data members and give you the functionality. For example, the get area function. So get area could access length and width, and it could do something useful. It could calculate the area of the rectangle. Data abstraction, object-oriented programming languages, they enable you to create new data types. They enable you to create new data types. So you can create new data abstractions. You can create new data abstractions. Now this term abstraction would appear a lot in this course. We'll talk about abstraction in detail in this course as well. And I hope this will be clear to you. We'll talk about some abstractions that you use on a daily basis, but maybe you don't realize कि ये सारा काम इस तरीके से हो रहा है. We also talked about inheritance of properties and behavior. So object-oriented programming languages, they give you this mechanism to extend existing classes. You can inherit their properties and behavior, and you can add new properties and behavior, or you can modify existing ones. You can override existing ones. ठीक है? For example, if you have a मेहरान, ठीक है? या आप मेहरान को छोड़ें, if you have, for example, XLI. So XLI has the interface of a brake pedal, but it does not have ABS. ठीक है, आप ब्रेक प्रेस करते हैं, गाड़ी रुकती है, लेकिन अंदर की functionality जो है, it is different than a GLI. So when you press the brake pedal, the ABS system is activated. ठीक है, so वो गाड़ी को रोकता है. Now the interface is the same, but the functionality has been overridden in the GLI. It is different in the XLI and the GLI. This is called function overriding. You have one class, ठीक है, it does something differently. For example, XLI brakes the car differently, and you want to change that. You don't want to change the interface. The interface is the same brake pedal, but you want to change the implementation. This is function overriding. Okay? Good question, please. So inheritance gives us a mechanism to either extend existing classes or change the functionality, the way those existing classes do certain things. So we can either add new methods or we can override existing methods. That is what it does. And then we talked about polymorphism or dynamic bonding of operations to objects, objects to function calls. So function calls are operations and objects are objects. So polymorphism, it basically helps you in that. So when we get to polymorphism, hopefully it will be clear by then, but you should remember these terms. Okay, this is important. We also talked about what a class is and what an object is. Again, I won't spend much time on this, but you should know, okay, a class is just a specification, okay, and objects are things that are created based upon that specification. So keep in mind the analogy of a map and an actual building. So a map is just specification, and an actual building is an actual physical structure that is constructed based upon that specification. Here objects are constructed, and whenever we say an object is constructed, so what we mean by that is it is allocated space in your random access memory. That is what we mean by it. Okay. This is how you define a class. Okay. In fact, this is a declaration. So you start with the keyword class, you specify a name for that class, the name should be meaningful, again those same rules that we use for any identifier. Then the opening curly brace, the closing curly brace, and this semicolon. Remember this semicolon whenever you're declaring. So Bazukat, you write everything correctly and you just miss the semicolon, and then you wonder what went wrong with this code, it doesn't work. Okay? So C++ and C, again their syntaxes, their compilers are very sensitive, so they want you to be very accurate with certain things, especially with these things. So what you do is we have done that, and I hope in the lab sessions you have also done this. So you can specify access specifiers, private or public or protected. We'll talk about these three. So if you want to keep a member function or data member private, you can explicitly declare it private, or by default the access specifier is private. And similarly you can specify a public data, और ये आप repeat भी कर सकते हैं. ऐसा नहीं है कि सिर्फ एक मतलब आप private लिख सकते हैं और सारे private data members. Ideally that should be the case, but you can repeat it. You can have multiple instances of private and then a private data member and public or a public. You can have that. ठीक है? That may not be advisable, but you can have that. Acha, just like we differentiate between a declaration of a class and a definition of a class. Class की declaration or class की definition, we differentiate between these two things. So if you have done the activities in lab that we did, so in the header file we used to write just the declaration of the class. Okay, so there we declare okay, this is the data member, this is the data member, these are the member functions. We do not provide implementation for those member functions. Okay, so that is declaration, and definition is when you define or when you provide bodies for those member functions. Okay, when you write the body of those member functions, that is definition of a class. If you remember yesterday, this code, here we provided declaration and definition together in one. So this is called inline declaration or definition. ठीक है? Inline functions का नाम सुना है आपने? Have you heard about inline functions? Okay, so that is also from computer programming. Now this is not a declaration. This isn't just a declaration. अगर आपको याद हो, so in the lab sessions we asked you in the header file you should only put declarations. यानी get width is a function, so you should end this with a semicolon. ठीक है? You should not provide the body. Body should be provided in another source file. So we restrict header files to declarations only. We do not put source code in header files. That is how it should be. Header files are header files. They are supposed to carry the declarations only. They are not supposed to carry the definitions. In this particular case, we have provided inline definitions of these functions. So declaration and definition, they are in the same file. Okay? Declaration and definition, they are in the same file. This is inline definition. So these are just terms. This is jargon. ठीक है? So it is always a good idea कि आपको terms का पता हो. Okay. So this is how you declare a class. ठीक है? Defining a new class. Basically, these are a couple of slides that talk about defining a new class. So this is the header where you specify the name of the class, and then the body of the class carries out, provides all the क्या कहते हैं the body basically provides the declaration of all the data members and member functions. Okay? So this was an example. Ours was slightly different, but this is an example of declaring a new class. Okay? So this is the class name. These are private and public, the access specifiers. So we want to keep the member functions public and data members private. Okay? Acha, this particular function, it changes the value of these attributes. This is our example basically. So this was our declaration and definition. We provided inline definitions for these classes. It was all in one. Okay? And this is how we used. This is our class definition. This is how we created objects. R1 and R2, these are basically objects of the class that we define. Okay? So this is how you create classes, you define classes and create objects. So we did that yesterday. Now, so a class is basically a combination of data members and member functions. So here we talk about non-static data members and static data members. Okay? So when you are creating or writing classes, how do you decide like which data members should you have? This is also an important question. So whenever you are defining a new class, a class is basically going to represent a set of entities. Okay, so we will have, for example, we defined the rectangle class and then we created a couple of rectangles. Okay? So what are the common characteristics that rectangles can have? So each rectangle has length and width. These are the two common characteristics. Okay? So you decide upon the common attributes that a set of objects have, and those attributes then become your data members, the data members of your class. Okay. A class data member can be of any data type. It can be of the built-in data type, like it can be an integer, a float, a double, a character. It can be a string. It can be an object of another class. A data member of a class can be an object of another class. Now we call that if there is a class which has an object of another class as its data member, so we say that these two classes are related to each other. They have a relationship and we call that relationship as has a relationship. Okay? Say for example, a car has an engine. Now a car is an object, but an engine is in itself an object. Okay? Similarly, an engine has, say, a fuel injection system. So an engine is an object, but a fuel injection system is in itself an object. So we can have objects that have other objects as their attributes. So we would say that these objects has a relationship. And we can create this relationship between objects by creating a data member which is an object of another class as a data member of some other class. ठीक है जिनके दरमियान ये relationship है. No, inheritance को हम कहते हैं कि it is a relationship. Inheritance is different. Inheritance is a different type of relationship. For example, a vehicle. ठीक है. Now a truck is a vehicle. A car is a vehicle, a motorcycle is a vehicle, a jeep is a vehicle. So a vehicle is a general class. ठीक है? And all these cars, trucks, buses, they are specific versions of that vehicle. So vehicle and bus, they have is a relationship, inheritance relationship. A car inherits all the characteristics of vehicles. ठीक है? So vehicle is a more general class. Car is a more specific class. Then you can have specific versions of a class. For example, you can have a sedan or you can have a hatchback. ठीक है? Or you can have maybe some other version of a class. Or for example, if you have a jeep and a car and you can merge the two and have an SUV or something like that. ठीक है? Or you can have a truck and a car and you can merge characteristics of the two and you can have an SUV. So is a relationship works like that. Has a is different. ठीक है? Is a में you inherit all the properties and behavior of another class. Here you do not inherit, you can use it, but you do not inherit, you do not become that class. ठीक है? So जैसे in for example in biology you have this classification of living beings into animals and plants, and then plants into angiosperms and gymnosperms, and then you have similarly animals में फिर बहुत सारी classes हैं. You have vertebrates and non-vertebrates and protozoans and पता नहीं क्या क्या arthropods और वगैरह वो phylum और phyla और families. So here on the top of the hierarchy you have more general classes. For example, living beings is the most general class and non-living beings. Now every living being, whether it is a plant or an animal, it will have certain attributes, okay, and it will have certain behavior. Or that behavior would then become more specific as we go down that class hierarchy. Asha, so class can have two types of data members. This is important. One is non-static data members. So non-static data members, and the other is static data members. Non-static data members are data members which are basically unique to each instance of that class. Okay? Every instance of a class has a unique value for that particular data member. So that data member is called a non-static data member. इसका मतलब क्या है? कि नॉन स्टैटिक डेटा मेंबर्स की सेपरेट कॉपी होगी फॉर ईच ऑब्जेक्ट ऑफ क्लास. फॉर एग्जांपल, if you're talking about car object, so every car object it has a unique chassis number and a unique say engine number. ठीक है. And maybe for example all the Altus Altuses say they are 1600 cc, so you can declare कि उसकी engine capacity is 6. That can be a static attribute if it does not change among Altuses. ठीक है. So think of it in that particular way. So बाज़ चीज़ें होती हैं कि जो हर ऑब्जेक्ट के लिए यूनिक होती हैं, they are non-static data members. So you will have separate copy of these data members in each object, and there are some attributes which remain the same for all the objects of a class. For example, all students of UET Peshawar, so the university information for them is the same. So we can have a static data member for the student class or for the UET student class which stores the information about the university. तो university का अगर नाम change होता है तो सबके लिए change होता है. ठीक है. So say for example, once upon a time it was NWP, University of Engineering and Technology Peshawar, and then it became UET Peshawar. So if we were to save that attribute individually for every student, तो फिर आप you can imagine कि कितनी मुश्किल होगी सबके लिए वो attribute change करना. And if it were to remain the same for all the objects, so you can have just one static data member जो कि इसको store कर सकता है. अच्छा, non-static data members cannot be initialized explicitly in the class body. When you are writing the class declaration, you cannot initialize non-static data members there. ठीक है? You can only initialize non-static data members through member functions, जैसे set function है या get set function या कोई और any other function, or you can use constructors for this purpose. Constructors का purpose ही यही है. They are special functions which are basically created to initialize data members of a class. So a constructor can basically initialize non-static data members or any other member function of the class. ठीक है? Now what are static data members? You can think of static data members as global attributes of a class. An attribute of a class that does not change for each object of that class, that remains the same. ठीक है? So you can have examples. एक दो examples आपको दिए हैं. For example, all Toyota cars, उनकी जो make होगी, that would be Toyota. ठीक है? For example, if there is a particular all GLIs, उनका जो फर्ज की अगर नाम है तो it would be say GLI if they store this attribute. So that would be a static data member. Achha, we talked about the students of a particular university. Similarly, you can think of these things. At times we have a functional requirement to keep track of the number of objects of a particular class. Okay, how many objects of a particular class have you created? For example, if we have rectangle objects, so if we want to keep track how many rectangle objects are there in RAM, so we can do that by having a static data member count and incrementing it whenever we create a new rectangle object and decrementing it whenever a rectangle object is destroyed. ठीक है? समझ आ रही है? ये we are talking about when should we have static data members या why static data members are important. ठीक है? So one is that there is an attribute that is global for all the objects of a class. You use static data members in that situation. The other is you have a functional requirement that you want to keep track of the number of objects of a particular class. ठीक है? So then you should have a static data member count which keeps count of all the objects of that particular class. So you need to have only one copy of that count for the entire class. You do not need several copies of it for all the objects of that class. ठीक है? So you have non-static data members, static data members. ठीक है? You should know what do we mean by that. How do you declare static data members? ठीक है? So you declare static data members by using the keyword static, and here we are declaring the static data member count. ठीक है? What does count do? Count basically keeps track of the number of rectangle objects that we have right now. ठीक है?
So you said that we can only declare static data member as set and get. As a set and get function.
No. I didn't say that.
You said that we can declare.
No. I didn't say that. Set and get functions that we talked about in some other context. but not in this particular context. Okay? So static data members, like, first you know what static data members are. Second, I hope you know that. Second, you should know when do you need static data members. Third, you should know if you need them, how to use them. So how can you declare and how can you modify? So this is how you declare. Now this is slightly, like, the declaration of static data members is slightly different. So the lab handout talks about that, because in lab you implement these classes differently. If we were to provide inline implementation of this class, inline definition of this class, this is fine then. ठीक है, आपने इसको यहाँ पे डिक्लेयर कर दिया, बट हम जो declaration, हम जो implementation करते हैं उसमें we have our main program in main.c++, we have the class declaration in a header file, and we have the class definition or implementation in a separate source file. In that particular case, you need to redefine the static variable in the separate source file at the file level. So कैसे करना है, it is written in the handout. ठीक है? So right now I don't want to go into those details. If I get time, so I'll basically record. I may record. I may not. I will not have time. I know that. But you should, like, learn as much as you can here, and then use this information tomorrow. And you can read the handout. So the handout spells it out very clearly how to use static data members. Okay. So in this particular case, ये जो case है where we have the implementation and everything in the same file. So here this would suffice. For example, if I say static int count, ठीक है? अच्छा. When is a rectangle created? Whenever a rectangle is created, you don't need to initialize a static data member. By default, it is initialized to 0. Non-static data members, they have garbage values, but static data members, they are initialized to 0 always. Okay? So you don't need to initialize them. So when is the purpose of count is to keep track of the number of rectangles that we have right now. Whenever a rectangle object is created, some constructor is called. Okay, so we have two constructors, the default constructor. So whenever a rectangle object would be created, the default constructor would be called. तो हम plus plus count कर रहे हैं, ठीक है? We are incrementing the count. And here also the overloaded constructor. So it may also be invoked to create a rectangle object. तो यहाँ पे भी हम इसको increment कर रहे हैं, plus plus count. So this way we would be able to keep track of the number of rectangles that we have in RAM right now. अब उसको read करना है. We want to read the number of rectangles. So we can say int get count. G, and then we can say return count. I haven't done what? Okay. Okay, so let's see. We created these. Acha. Let us say cout number of rectangles in rectangle objects in RAM is, and then R2 dot get count. Acha, the beauty about static data members is if you call it using R1 or R2, it doesn't matter. Okay? You will get the same value. R2 dot get count and R1 dot get count, it would return you the same value. Why? Because there is just one copy of the count variable. It does not have unique copies for R1 and R2. Okay? Acha, and then and there. अच्छा, अब R2 R1 के create करने के बाद let us call this again. Number of rectangle objects in RAM is R2 dot get count. We'll get an updated value. Let us suppose we create another rectangle object. Rectangle. In fact, R. So let us create an array of rectangle objects. Okay? Let us create an array of rectangle objects, 10 rectangle objects, and then see what is the number of rectangle objects. Okay? Let us build and run this file. अच्छा क्या कह रहा है? अनडिफाइंड रेफरेंस टू रेक्टेंगल काउंट। अच्छा हैं? कहाँ पे? हाँ प्राइवेट वेरिएबल है, प्राइवेट है बिल्कुल। कहाँ से मैं डायरेक्ट एक्सेस करता हूँ? नहीं, आई एम एक्सेसिंग द गेट काउंट फंक्शन। I am accessing the get count function. The get count function is a public function. Line number 12. Yes, so even if count is a private data member, I am accessing it from within the class. ठीक है? एरर की वजह वो नहीं है, एरर दूसरी वजह से है। सो एरर की वजह ये है, लेट अस static int count. अच्छा जी, undefined reference to rectangle count, get count, नाम सही लिखा है? public int get count। अच्छा एक सेकेंड, एक सेकेंड, एक सेकेंड, आ गया get count जी। एक सेकेंड, static int count, static int, एक सेकेंड, एक सेकेंड, बातें नहीं प्लीज, क्वाइट यूज व्हेन डिफाइनिंग। अच्छा हम्म, नहीं नहीं नहीं, अच्छा दिस इज बेसिकली स्कोप रेजोल्यूशन। वी आर ट्राइंग टू टेल कि काउंट जो है वो किस क्लास का डेटा मेंबर है। सो यू हैव टू डू इट व्हेन यू आर डूइंग इट देयर, ठीक है? अच्छा लेट अस, इसको आई विल फिक्स इट, ठीक है? फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल जस्ट अंडरस्टैंड कि हम करना क्या चाह रहे हैं। नाउ दिस इज द static variable count which basically keeps track of the number of rectangle objects, ठीक है? तो अगर आपने फर्ज किया ऐसी फंक्शनैलिटी देनी है, तो वेन एवर यू आर क्रिएटिंग अ रेक्टेंगल ऑब्जेक्ट विच यू डू इन बाय यूजिंग कंस्ट्रक्टर्स, यू शुड इंक्रीमेंट दिस वेरिएबल। यहाँ पे हमने डिस्ट्रक्टर को ओवरराइड नहीं किया होगा। सो इफ यू रियली वांट टू कीप लाइक इट अपडेटेड, तो जब भी कोई ऑब्जेक्ट डिस्ट्रॉय होता है तो डिस्ट्रक्टर फंक्शन कॉल होता है। सो इन दैट पर्टिकुलर केस फिर आपने इसको डेक्रीमेंट करना है फ्रॉम विद इन द बॉडी ऑफ द डिस्ट्रक्टर फंक्शन, ठीक है? तो फिलहाल वो हमने बात नहीं की, लेकिन जब हम उसकी तरफ आएंगे तो फिर उसकी इम्प्लीमेंटेशन भी देंगे। नाउ लेट्स गो थ्रू द स्लाइड्स, ठीक है? कोड की तरफ बाद में फिर आएंगे हम। नाउ द स्टैटिक वेरिएबल काउंट जो है, स्टैटिक डेटा मेंबर काउंट, इसकी एक कॉपी होती है फॉर ऑल द ऑब्जेक्ट्स ऑफ अ क्लास, ठीक है? सो वी हैव दीज थ्री ऑब्जेक्ट्स, फॉर एग्जांपल R1, R2, R3। सो R1 की ये जो नॉन स्टैटिक एट्रीब्यूट्स हैं, विड्थ और लेंथ, इनकी सेपरेट कॉपीज होती हैं फॉर ईच ऑब्जेक्ट। बट जो स्टैटिक एट्रीब्यूट है काउंट, इसकी सेपरेट कॉपी होती है, सॉरी इसकी एक कॉपी होती है फॉर ऑल दी ऑब्जेक्ट्स ऑफ द क्लास। तीन ऑब्जेक्ट्स हो, एक ऑब्जेक्ट हो, या 1000 ऑब्जेक्ट्स हो, इट डजेंट मैटर, ठीक है? दैट इज द डिफरेंस बिटवीन स्टैटिक एंड नॉन स्टैटिक डेटा मेंबर्स। ये आपने याद रखना है। तो स्टैटिक डेटा मेंबर्स को फिर हम उन एट्रीब्यूट्स को स्टोर करने के लिए यूज करते हैं विच आर कॉमन एट्रीब्यूट्स अमंग ऑल द ऑब्जेक्ट्स ऑफ अ क्लास, ठीक है, क्योंकि उनकी एक ही कॉपी होती है. And static attributes, for example, if you can access the static attribute through any object. You can say r1.getCount or r2.getCount or r3.getCount and you'll get the same value. ठीक है, क्योंकि दिस इज स्टैटिक एट्रीब्यूट, इट हैज ओनली वन कॉपी. बट अगर आप कहते हैं ना r1.getWidth और r1.getLength, you will get a different value compared to r2.getWidth or r2.getLength, क्योंकि उनकी सेपरेट कॉपीज हैं. उनकी वैल्यू सेम हो सकती हैं बट यू आर एक्सेसिंग अ डिफरेंट लोकेशन. समझ में आई नॉन स्टैटिक और स्टैटिक डेटा मेंबर्स का ये डिफरेंस? अच्छा, so whenever you are defining a class, you are defining the data members of that class and you are defining the member functions of that class. Data members को define जब आप करते हैं तो you can have non-static data members and static data members. ठीक है? So that discussion is kind of complete. When you are defining member functions of a class, so member functions first of all, what do they do? Member functions जो हैं, नंबर एक वो आपको functionality provide करते हैं, ठीक है, the behavior of the class. और दूसरा, since it is always advised कि you should always keep the data members private, so data members, member functions, they give you access to those data members as well. So they can help, they can help you read the member functions, get functions, or they can help you modify those data members, set functions. ठीक है? तो member functions के दो काम होते हैं. एक क्लास की फंक्शनैलिटी प्रोवाइड करना, जैसे रेक्टेंगल क्लास में वी हैड द गेट एरिया फंक्शन. सो द गेट एरिया फंक्शन provided the functionality of the class, it calculated the area, and then we also provided the get width and get length and set width and set length functions. So these are accessor functions which basically give you access to the private data members, just like data members. G. Static data member is static member function. Acha, we have not talked about static member functions, but we can have static member functions as well. हमने उनकी बात नहीं की, लेकिन we can have static member functions. ठीक है? Right now we only talked about static data members. If you are using a static member function, so you define it exactly the same way as any other member function, but the only thing that you do is you use the keyword static with it. ठीक है? तो ये उसमें फर्क होता है. अब स्टैटिक मेंबर फंक्शन फिर इज अ स्पेशल मेंबर फंक्शन. उसकी कुछ लिमिटेशंस होती हैं. स्टैटिक मेंबर फंक्शन कैन ओनली एक्सेस स्टैटिक डेटा. इट कैन नॉट एक्सेस नॉन स्टैटिक डेटा मेंबर्स. ठीक है? Although we haven't talked about static member functions, but since the question arose, so static member functions को आप जब यूज करते हैं, so they can only access static data members, they cannot access non-static data members. क्यों? कोई बता सकता है? अच्छा, now non-static data members का मसला ये है कि non-static data members can only exist when you create an object of a class. Non-static data members, they can only exist when you create an object of a class. ठीक है? Static data members always exist. As soon as your program is running, static data members, they are created. ठीक है? Yeah. अब call जो है, you can call them by first creating an object and then using the handle of the object. Yeah, you can access them just by using the name of the class. ठीक है? Rectangle class का static data member, you can access it by just writing rectangle.getCount. You do not have any rectangle object, physical object in RAM, but you can still access the static data members of the rectangle class. ठीक है? We didn't talk about it क्योंकि मैं इसको ज़रा सा सिंपल रखना चाहता था. Data member को public, you can have a public static data member. Yes, you can have, but you should not have. Data members should always be kept private. ठीक है? You can have public data members, but you should not have public data members. ठीक है? Can और should का फर्क है. अच्छा, so when you are creating or defining member functions, so you put their declarations inside the class body. ठीक है, मेंबर फंक्शंस की डेक्लेरेशन आप क्लास बॉडी के अंदर डालते हैं. यू कैन डिफाइन दोज मेंबर फंक्शंस इनसाइड द क्लास बॉडी और आउटसाइड द क्लास बॉडी. ये दोनों काम हम कर चुके हैं. लास्ट लेक्चर में वी डिड इट इनसाइड द क्लास बॉडी, दैट वाज इनलाइन डेफिनेशन ऑफ द मेंबर फंक्शंस. एंड इन द लैब सेशंस या उसके लिए जो डेमोज हैं उसमें वी डू इट आउटसाइड द क्लास बॉडी. ठीक है. Member functions can access all the data members of a class, whether they are public or private. किसी क्लास का अपना डेटा मेंबर फंक्शन जो है वो उस क्लास के तमाम डेटा मेंबर्स को एक्सेस कर सकता है, उस पर कोई रोक टोक नहीं होती. ठीक है. किसी क्लास का मेंबर फंक्शंस किसी दूसरे क्लास के सिर्फ पब्लिक डेटा मेंबर्स और पब्लिक मेंबर फंक्शंस को एक्सेस कर सकता है. ठीक है. वो उसके हर मेंबर फंक्शंस और डेटा मेंबर को नहीं एक्सेस कर सकता, लेकिन अपने डेटा मेंबर्स और मेंबर फंक्शंस तमाम को एक्सेस कर सकता है. You can invoke or call a member functions by either using the dot member access operator or using the arrow member access operator. So you use the dot member access operator with the objects of a class, and you use the arrow member access operator with pointers to object of a class. ये भी एक डेमो में हम कर चुके हैं. We'll return this to this point again as well. ठीक है. अच्छा जी. So this is how you define, this is how you declare these. This is declaration of the member function. We have done it. Asha. And if you provide the implementation right here, जैसे कि हमने कल किया था, कि not only do we provide the declaration, we also provide the definition. So this is inline definition of this member function is then an inline member function of the class. ठीक है? If you provide the definition outside in another source file, in a separate source file, this is how you do it. ठीक है. So then you specify कि ये जो member function जिसको हम यहाँ पे define कर रहे हैं ये किस class का member function है. So you use the scope resolution operator. You specify the class name and you then specify the scope resolution operator and then उस function को फिर आप define करते हैं. इन दोनों का because we are changing the data members, उनकी values को change कर रहे हैं. We are not returning or calculating anything. That's why it's void. ठीक है. It does not return any value. समझ आई इसकी? Do you know? ये पहला जो केस है, this is implementation definition of the class inside a header file. The other one is कि declaration is in a header file, but definition is in a separate source file. इस तरह के lab में हम करते रहें. So this is how you do it. So this is the class name and then the scope resolution operator and then the member function name जिसको आप define करना चाह रहे हैं. And that source file can have the definitions of member functions of different classes. ठीक है. एक ही क्लास के member function की definition जरूरी नहीं कि उसमें हो, मुख्तलिफ classes की member functions की definitions हो सकती हैं उसमें. अच्छा, ये वो this is the way we use the dot operator to access a particular member function. This is the arrow operator. So here R1 is an object of a class. This is pointer to an object of a class, pointer to a rectangle object. That's why we add RP. So pointer to rectangle object. ठीक है? So I guess in one of the demos we did it as well. Acha. Now we can have static member functions and non-static member functions, but for the time being we are not talking about those. Right now we are more interested in const member functions and non-const member functions. एक तो होता है const data member या constant variable. तो constant variable क्या होता है कि you declare a variable and you initialize it at the time of declaration. For example, we can have const float pi. ठीक है. So we can initialize it at the time of declaration. अब इसके बाद इस statement के बाद the value of pi cannot be changed. ठीक है. The value of pi cannot be changed. अच्छा. This is a const variable or a constant. What do we mean by a const member function? अच्छा, फिलहाल मैं इसको comment out करता हूँ. This used to give us problems. Now a const member function by definition is a member function that does not modify the state of an object. कोई भी मेंबर फंक्शन अगर वो स्टेट ऑफ एन ऑब्जेक्ट को मॉडिफाई नहीं करता, इट डज नॉट चेंज द वैल्यू ऑफ एनी एट्रीब्यूट, दैट मेंबर फंक्शन इज अ कांस्ट मेंबर फंक्शन. फॉर एग्जांपल, get width does not change length or width attributes of a rectangle object. It only reads the width property. So we can declare the get width function as a const member function क्योंकि ये क्लास की जो स्टेट है उसको चेंज नहीं करता. ठीक है. अच्छा, फर्स्ट लेट्स गो थ्रू दिस थिंग एंड देन we'll say कि where does the motivation come from. एक second, we have 5 minutes or something like that. Yes, we have 5 minutes. अच्छा, बातें नहीं प्लीज. So const member function जो है, it is a member function that does not modify the attributes of an object or a class. अगर class के attributes को नहीं modify करता, तो then the member function is a const member function. ठीक है. अच्छा, इसकी corollary क्या है? What are the effects of this statement? इसका मतलब ये है कि अगर एक member function को आपने const declare कर दिया है, तो then that member function cannot change the value of any attribute. उसके अंदर we cannot have a statement like w is equal to something. That becomes illegal. Similarly, it cannot change an attribute indirectly. यानी आप उसके अंदर ये स्टेटमेंट भी नहीं कर सकते, किसी ऐसे फंक्शन को भी नहीं कॉल कर सकते जो कि चेंज स्टेट को चेंज कर रहा हो. लूप में कॉल करने की कोई मुमानियत नहीं है. दैट यू कैन डू. आप समझें कि कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन कौन सा मेंबर फंक्शन होता है? वो मेंबर फंक्शन जो उस क्लास के एट्रीब्यूट्स को चेंज ना करे. इसकी इसकी आसान मिसाल क्या है? ऐसा मेंबर फंक्शन जिसके अंदर ऐसी कोई स्टेटमेंट ना हो. ठीक है. यानी w इज इक्वल टू समथिंग, एनीथिंग, या l इज इक्वल टू समथिंग. ये स्टेटमेंट उसमें नहीं इसकी इजाजत है. क्यों? क्योंकि w and l these are the attributes of the rectangle class और आप इसको चेंज कर रहे हैं. So a const member function cannot do that. If I declare this function as a const member function, then it cannot do it. कैसे मैं डिक्लेयर करूंगा इसको as a const member function? So I'll use the keyword const here. ठीक है. So ये है फंक्शन डबल, इसकी रिटर्न टाइप, फंक्शन का नाम और फंक्शन के पैरामीटर लिस्ट, एंड देन आफ्टर दैट वी यूज द कीवर्ड const. So that is how we declare that this function is a const. Once you declare it as a const, तो फिर आप ये काम उसमें नहीं कर सकते. यानी इसमें फिर किसी वेरिएबल को कोई वैल्यू नहीं असाइन कर सकते, या ये चालाकी वाला काम भी नहीं कर सकते आप कि आप कहें कि जी यहाँ से मैं सेट लेंथ कॉल कर लेता हूँ. खुद यहाँ कुछ नहीं ऐसा चेंज करता, बट आई कॉल अ फंक्शन जो कि किसी चीज़ को, किसी एट्रीब्यूट को चेंज कर रहा है. सो बोथ दीज थिंग्स आर इलीगल. देन ये भी इलीगल है और ये भी इलीगल है. Understand? Why? Because we declared this function as a const. That's why these two things are illegal. अच्छा, आपने किसी फंक्शन को const डिक्लेयर करना है तो वो आपने बाय यानी एक्सप्लिसिटली डिक्लेयर करना है. आप अगर कहें कि जी ये वाला फंक्शन जो है इट डज नॉट चेंज द एट्रीब्यूट्स ऑफ रेक्टेंगल क्लास, नहीं चेंज कर रहा ना, ये गेट विथ फंक्शन जो है सिर्फ रीड कर रहा है. सो क्या ये कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन है या नहीं? द आंसर इज नो. यू हैव टू एक्सप्लिसिटली डिक्लेयर इट टू बी अ कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन. हाँ, ये कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन की तरह बिहेव कर रहा है, बट कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन है नहीं. ठीक है. अच्छा, यू माइट ऑल्सो आस्क कि जी ये कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन को हमें डिस्कस करने की जरूरत क्यों पड़ी? वाई डू वी नीड टू टॉक अबाउट कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन? नाउ लुक एट दिस पर्टिकुलर सिचुएशन. ये आपके पास एक वेरिएबल है, इसको आपने const डिक्लेयर किया. दैट मीन्स यू कैन नॉट चेंज इट्स वैल्यू. ठीक है, फाइन. क्या हम किसी ऑब्जेक्ट को डिक्लेयर कर सकते हैं एज अ const? यानी कैन वी हैव अ कांस्टेंट रेक्टेंगुलर ऑब्जेक्ट? कैन वी हैव समथिंग लाइक दिस, const rectangle say 4 and 5. अच्छा, गलत कर दिया. R3 const rectangle R3. So we just created a constant rectangle object. अच्छा, अगर आप ये करते हैं ये काम, ठीक है, ये get count वाला अभी काम नहीं कर रहा, इसको मैं कमेंट आउट कर देता हूँ। अच्छा, सो वी हैव अ कांस्टेंट रेक्टेंगल ऑब्जेक्ट R3, ठीक है, एंड वी वांट टू फाइंड आउट कि इसका एरिया क्या है, ठीक है, वी वांट टू फाइंड आउट कि इसका एरिया क्या है। आई गेस वी शुड बी एबल टू डू दैट इज माय एक्सपेक्टेशन कि हमें ऐसा काम कर लेना चाहिए, मतलब इसमें कोई मसला नहीं। एरिया जो है, गेट एरिया फंक्शन डज नॉट मॉडिफाई द ऑब्जेक्ट इन थिंग्स लाइक दैट। लेट अस बिल्ड एंड रन इट। अच्छा, इसको कमेंट आउट करना है जी, बस ये आखिरी। अच्छा जी, इसको एक सेकंड प्लीज, इसको रहने दें इंट काउंट एंड लेट अस मेक इट रिटर्न गेट काउंट फाइन। पासिंग कांस्टेंट दिस आर्गुमेंट डिस्कार्ड्स क्वालिफायर्स। अच्छा, we wanted to find out the area of this object R3 but we cannot do it, ठीक है, क्यों नहीं कर सकते? now this is the problem and this is why you need const member functions। अगर आपके पास एक क्लास है और उस क्लास का कोई भी यूजर जो है उसके const ऑब्जेक्ट्स डिक्लेयर करता है या क्रिएट करता है, so then that class becomes unusable अगर आप const member functions को नहीं यूज करते, ठीक है। अब इस गेट एरिया फंक्शन को मैं कॉल नहीं कर सकता, क्यों नहीं कर सकता? क्योंकि अकॉर्डिंग टू द कंपाइलर गेट एरिया फंक्शन इज अ नॉन कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शन and we are calling it for a const object, so the compiler thinks that you might be modifying the state of the object through this get area function। हम नहीं कर रहे मॉडिफाई, हमारा कोड जो है उसको अगर आप देख लें, गेट एरिया में हम w और l को कोई नई वैल्यू नहीं असाइन कर रहे। But the compiler doesn't care. The compiler wants you to explicitly say कि get area function is a const member function, ठीक है। और वो हम कैसे कह सकते हैं? So this is the get area function say, and it does not change the state of the object, so we say get area and then we use the keyword const, ठीक है। So we make it explicitly, we say कि get area is a const member function। Now if we build and run this code, at least ये statement हमें error नहीं देगी, ठीक है। अच्छा, नाउ R1 डॉट गेट एरिया, R1 वाज नॉट डिक्लेयर्ड इन द स्कोप। अच्छा, R1 को हमने उसकी डिक्लेरेशन ख़त्म कर दी। अच्छा, यहाँ पे है, ठीक है। अच्छा, सो नाउ वी डोंट हैव दैट प्रॉब्लम, उस प्रॉब्लम को हमने सॉल्व कर लिया है, समझ आई ना? R1, अच्छा, डू यू अंडरस्टैंड द प्रॉब्लम? The problem is, yani the motivation, why do we need const member functions? We need const member functions because a user, anybody who uses your code, that person may decide to create a const object. Once that person creates a const object, your class almost immediately becomes useless for that person। Why? Because वो कोई भी function उसका call नहीं कर सकता, ठीक है, for that object, const function हो या non const हो, यानी ऐसे मेंबर फंक्शन जिसमें ऑब्जेक्ट को आप मॉडिफाई कर रहे हैं या नहीं कर रहे, दोनों को वो नहीं कॉल कर सकता। आपने उसका हल क्या है? उसका हल ये है कि दोज मेंबर फंक्शंस व्हिच डू नॉट मॉडिफाई द स्टेट ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट, यू हैव टू डिक्लेयर दोज मेंबर फंक्शंस एक्सप्लिसिटली एज कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शंस, ठीक है। गेट लेंथ, इट डज नॉट मॉडिफाई द स्टेट ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट। गेट विड्थ डज नॉट मॉडिफाई द स्टेट ऑफ द ऑब्जेक्ट, ठीक है। Set width and set length, they modify the state of the object, so we cannot declare them as const member functions। Similarly, get area, it does not modify the state of the object, तो आपने इनको explicitly const declare कर देने। So for a const object, the const member functions they would be executable, इनको execute किया जा सकेगा। अगर आपने ये नहीं किया हुआ तो फिर कोई member function नहीं execute हो सकता, जैसे कि हमने देखा, ठीक है। So that is why we need const member functions. ठीक है, so आज के लिए इतना ही, and then we'll continue this discussion in the next lecture. ठीक है, so you should have some idea about static and non-static data members, const and non-const member functions. अच्छा, how to use static data members, now that is given in the handout very clearly. उसको हम यहाँ पे implement कर सकते थे by creating a separate source file. I would look कि ये क्यों काम नहीं कर रहा, या how to make it work in inline situations. ठीक है, and then I'll get back to you on this one as well. तो ये क्लास ख़त्म है, 1:30 हमने टाइम पे ख़त्म कर ली. ठीक है, if you have any questions you can ask. It is clear हैं? What is your name? आपके राइट पे जो बैठा हुआ है मुनीब, मुनीब को समझ आ गई ये कॉन्स्ट. ठीक है, कॉन्स्ट मेंबर फंक्शंस. जी जी, any other question?